Hey everybody, welcome again to another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. This one is a bit earlier than normal, but it's going to be a good one to get involved with here. So we've got a really interesting story, one that I've been doing some understanding of and some digging on my own a little bit over the last couple of days about. So I'm really excited for this one because it's a great story. So we have joining us today Ernst Arbouw, a Dutch journalist who literally kind of just stumbled on this story almost completely literally with that word and did a lot of digging on it and really came and brought the story to life. So it's really excited to hear from the person who has done all this work. And also it just kind of again worked out well this week that these stories that this week has been all about personal stories and Canadian loss during the war. Again, not planned, but it's again another great way to kind of wrap up this week and another story that I think you're all going to enjoy. Hey, Ernst, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, you're very welcome. Thanks for coming on and sharing the story with me and all the different stuff. Again, some of it's in Dutch, so it's not really my wheelhouse, but you got an English translation, which was amazing. But I did some digging, different stuff. So again, this is a great story. So, like I said, you're a journalist, so you've been digging on this for quite a number of years now, and the story's got depth and different layers to it, and it keeps going. But we'll get into that. But just to begin, I wanted to kind of get your insight and your explanation of how you even came to this story or how you first discovered it. I think that in itself is a story so that I find interesting. So I think everyone watching will really like to hear that.
Well, it's the story about a Canadian soldier, a boy from Toronto, 21 years old, Harold Roszell. And I as you said, I literally stumbled into the story. It was a Tuesday in autumn, 6 years ago, I believe. And I was going about my business, browsing across some Facebook pages, and there's one Facebook page for the foresters in the village where I live. There's a few nature reserves and a small woodland. Well, managed by a conservation society, and one of the foresters had put up a picture of a tree with initials in it, and it said H.W.R, Toronto, Canada, and he'd written underneath, "We can still touch our liberators here," and it sort of hit me like. If you have a person's initials and you know where he's from, it should not be that difficult to find him. Mm-hmm. And that was naive, I know now, but as all good things start with a bit of naivety, I just started looking. I started searching to see what I could find, and one of the first things I did, actually the same evening, was fire off an email to Veteran Affairs Canada to say, well, is there anything like lists or archives about Canadian soldiers who were in the Netherlands in 1945? And their answer was basically, it's a very interesting question, but unfortunately we can't help you. Good luck with it. And
yeah, that's unfortunate, but that's the case with most of these kinds of requests.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden I realized that there actually is a list, albeit a very small list, relatively small list, I should say, of Canadian soldiers who we know were in the Netherlands, and that's the boys who were killed in the Netherlands. There are about 5,000 Canadian war graves in Bergen op Zoom, Groesbeek, and Holten, managed by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. They have an excellent database. And I just thought, what would happen if I go to their database and type in the initials, and I could sort of narrow it down, because I know the date the village was liberated, 13th of April 1945. And then I started using blanks and whatever database code, and then I pushed enter, and a name popped up out of nothing. So that suddenly there was one name, Harold Wilbert Roszell, from the headquarters of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, and it sort of matched because the village where I live is about 10 kilometers from Groningen, a larger city in the north of the Netherlands, which was liberated between 13 and 16 April by the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. And I knew they had their headquarters here in this village, not far from the woodland where the tree is. So that sort of started the whole thing going.
Yeah, and I think one part that probably did age you, and again, this is the Canadian perspective on this, is that the fight for that area is fairly well known by, I would say, by Canadian standards. As I always kind of say on this channel, it's our understanding isn't quite where it should be, but the Netherlands itself, as you and me were chatting about, is very well understood in Canada, and there's all kinds of connections, and everyone has some sort of connection or knows the story at least. So I think in that sense, it's quite helpful that we are able to identify this, especially because I think, again, this is such a unique story, not only the mark that is left, literally like a literal mark, but also his story and where he was. And I say that because he was attached to the headquarters of the 2nd Division, which is quite rare, right? You're usually attached to a regiment or a battery or, an armored regiment or that kind of thing. So to be attached to a headquarters is quite rare. So I think that in and of itself is a unique part of this story, and also one of the tragic parts of this story as well, as we'll get to talk to. But so once you've kind of discovered the photo and the Facebook page and everything, you went to the location. I wonder if you could tell us about that, because that's got to be fascinating to hear.
Yeah, well, first the boy Quizling, who originally found the tree and put this photo online, he lived just down my street, about 100 meters from here. So I called him and I said, well, I found this picture you posted online, but there's quite a few trees in the area.
Yeah.
So, could you point me into the right direction? And
nice mug, by the way.
yes. So one day in November, we went down to the woodland, and he showed me where it was. And it's a real strange experience, because by that time I learned a little bit more about Harold. I found a short newspaper story from the Toronto Star about his death, and I found information about him in the catalog of the Library and Archives in Ottawa. Mm-hmm. So I could tell a few things about him by that time, but to actually stand there and to be able to trace his initials in the tree, and to think I'm standing right in this boy's footsteps, and to know that he died shortly afterwards. Mm. I mean, to think what must he have been thinking when he was writing those letters to Toronto. I can only think that his thoughts were Toronto, almost hope. He could smell Toronto. Mm. And then he still didn't make it home. And that, so that's a bit sad, but also to be so close to history, to actually see history literally in front of you it's an extraordinary experience. So then the next thing I needed to do was, of course, try and see if I could find a family, people who could tell me a bit more about him. And I had an amazing stroke of luck there. When I say stroke of luck, it's actually quite tragic. About 3 weeks before I found this picture of Harold's tree, his his brother-in-law had died in Canada. So I found an online announcement of a funeral home in Toronto with names of all the family members in it. So his sister, who had passed away earlier, and nieces and grandnieces, about 14 or 15 of them. And I just started, basically I just started Googling them until I found one from where I could confirm that she was a family member. And I just sent her an email. Or basically we started on Twitter, exchanging short messages, and then that developed into an email conversation. And a few hours later, the same day, one of her aunts, so an original niece of Harold, sent me an email, and she said, Ernst, I heard about this story. I heard about what you found. And by complete accident, I'm going to be in Amsterdam in 10 days' time. We should meet. And that was both nerve-wracking, but also lovely, wonderful people, great meeting. So we had arranged to meet in their hotel in Amsterdam, Lynn and Gord, and that was such a wonderful meeting.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's several pieces written on this, particularly from the CBC, that I can link afterwards if people want to dig a little deeper. But it's so great to hear this. I mean, two thoughts pop in my head. The first is blessings of technology and social media, right? It can be bad, and I'm putting that mildly, in many ways. But to me, this is one of the great things about it. And doing history this way is the people you can connect with, the people you can meet easily, right? You and me are nowhere near each other, and yet we were able to connect through Twitter ourselves and talk about this, and then email. It's great. So I think that's a good thing. But again, too, the second thing that pops into my head, and I've read this numerous times, and meeting people myself in both France and Belgium, connections with it. It's great how there's you don't know what people are like, but then there's this connection that everybody has people and has with each other with these stories. I think it's amazing that we're able to bring in our different perspectives and different insights and into all of this, and to be able to build a story is amazing. And I think it's such a 21st century kind of thing with social media, and then, before COVID, ease of travel and all of that. So I
couldn't have made, Brad, I couldn't have made this story about 10 years ago. Impossible, because social media wasn't then what it is now. Yeah. But also, I would not have been able, in 5 years' time, I will not be able to write it as it is now, because I traveled to Canada in 2017, and I was able to meet veterans, people who had actually been in Groningen, who had actually fought in the liberation of the Netherlands. Well, year after year, the numbers get fewer. Mm-hmm. There is only a small window in time where I could actually make this story. So in a way, I've been quite lucky, which is a strange word to use because Harold is dead. So I feel
there's always these tragic elements, right? When like, especially because I said earlier, these stories that I've had people on talking about this week, they all have tragic endings, unfortunately. Yeah. But this is the nature of history and military history, and what I do and what you've done and all of this. It's unfortunate, but again, this is the best we can do for these who've lost their lives, is just tell their story. And I do want to say thank you for doing so and bringing this to light. I think this is an amazing story. So kind of next, so how you kind of moved through that, and then you said you went to Ottawa, did the research, which I know all too well, living here and being a historian myself. So maybe we can talk about that a bit after. But at the beginning here, I do want to talk about Roszell's story, and I wonder if you could just kind of give us an overview of what his service was like, and as much of his story as you were able to uncover.
I think the most important thing to know about Harold is that his story is actually he was just a normal boy. He was just a normal kid from Toronto. And when you look at his papers, which are held in the library and archives in Ottawa, there's this attestation form which he signed on the day he signed up for the army. And
Yep.
an officer asked him, "What are your reasons for going into the army?" And there was just one word: adventure.
Mm-hmm.
And he was I have now been informed that at the time, Ottawa was not Ottawa, sorry, Toronto.
Toronto.
Was incredibly boring. That you couldn't buy beer on a Sunday. That you couldn't play baseball on a Sunday. And he had an older brother, Albert, who was already in the army. And it's so easy for me to imagine this boy in Toronto being bored, senseless, with a war going on in Europe, thinking to himself, there must be a way to get out of here, to get out of here. And that he was underage.
Yes,
he was 17 when he joined the army. In fact, the first time he tried to join the army, he was 16. And his father intervened. His father, who was a First World War veteran, intervened and took him out. And then, from what I could find, he tried a second time. And this time, too, his father intervened. And then the third time, when he joined up the third time, his father said, "Well, if you really want to be in the army, well, so be it. I can't stop you."
I mean, there's two things that I wanted to jump in with there. Is you're exactly right about Toronto. I was going to say, this is, especially for Canadians watching or any people who know Toronto, this isn't the Toronto of today. It's just the Canadian cities have changed so much from the Second World War. You have so many factors like travel, immigration, that have made the cities what they are today. But back in the 30s and 40s, Toronto was very much like the rest of Southern Ontario, very buttoned down, like you said, boring. Again, I don't want to get into that, but this is something that I think is forgotten. And it's just, and also there's another element to this too, is the Depression, right? The Great Depression hit Canada, particularly Southern Ontario, very, very hard. It's something that cannot be ignored when talking about these veteran stories, the things that some of them went through, and just how bad it really truly was. I think we're starting to forget that a lot, particularly with Canadian Second World War stories, is how bad it was. So again, there's no money, boredom. What else are you going to do, right? Here's an opportunity. A lot of people saw it as an opportunity, like you said, for adventure, for whatever reason. So I think that's an important part of this. And too, like you said, with his father, that's a common story as well, particularly for a lot of Canadians, is underage, signing up underage. We had in the other show, someone brought up that there's no birth certificates really at this time. They don't really exist. You mentioned how he uses his brother's ID to try and get in, and then gets caught with that. So it's quite interesting. But again, but also there's tons of stories of the parents being like, he's just going to keep doing it. What's the point? Let him go. But anyway, so I think there's just two threads that I think are important in this story. Is those Toronto is not Toronto of today, and this underage signing is far more common than one would think.
But the interesting thing is, Toronto has changed over the past 80 years. I mean, everybody knows. But the interesting thing is that for a short period during the war, his family lived in Yonge Street. Yonge Street 550 and a half, a bit Harry Potter-esque address. But actually, the house still stands, amazingly, because all of Yonge Street has changed. But you can still go there. And actually, when I was doing research in Toronto, my apartment was just around the corner from there. It was about 200, 300 meters from where I stayed, and it's such an amazing feeling, and interesting to think that this is actually the street where he walked. This is actually the street where his mother and his sisters walked. And the other two addresses I have for the family are Marlborough Avenue and another one, which I can't remember from the top of my head. They're not far away. It's all within walking distance.
Yep.
So yes, the city has changed, but it's still possible to trace him and his family through the city.
Yeah, it's another thing too. Excuse me, is Toronto was expanded so much that, and people think that it's always been like that. And that's not the case. That's a very recent thing. But again, yeah, you're right. It's this Toronto has this little core chunk of it, which now seen as the downtown area, and I think that's great. Like there's so many of these addresses that do still exist that are still the same house, like literally the same physical house in this country, and that's a part I think we forget here. We don't think about it that way. And again, that's great as someone from outside the country to bring up that we do have this connection to history. Because again, we think about the history, and especially when it comes to military history, happening elsewhere, right? That's your backyard. And then to say that our backyard is great to see is, to me, it's amazing to see how it can come across from different people. So that is amazing that you got that experience. I think that's really great.
I think there's one more thing I should say about Harold and his military record is that he, I think from basically his career in the military, you can deduce that he was an above average soldier. Right. Sorry, he was a private, lowest rank in the military, but still. As a private, he worked as a batman to an officer, and usually the soldiers who were selected to be an officer's batman, they were above average. You wouldn't want a lousy, sloppy batman, basically. And then after this. This officer he worked for went back to the United Kingdom for additional training. Right. Harold moved into general duties at the 2nd Division headquarters. And when he died, there was a condolence letter, not only from the army chaplain, but also one that was signed by 20 or maybe 30 officers from the 2nd Division headquarters, and that's an extraordinary thing that usually doesn't happen. And they had specifically asked to be allowed to sign this letter. And
also, if you could talk the war diary as well, right?
Yeah, there's another thing. Harold's death and his army mate John Tuckey, they died together, or at least they died in the same night. They are mentioned in the divisional war diaries, and that's unusual because normally private soldiers are not mentioned in war diaries. Just doesn't happen. Nope. And though they are not mentioned by name, it's fairly obvious that the war diarist meant Harold and John, and they are the only two privates mentioned in the war diaries between Normandy and VE Day. So all in all, I think their death must have been a bit of a shock.
Yeah,
to the other soldiers.
Yeah, and I mean that is so unusual, and like you said, I mean, I want to just add a little bit of gravity to that. It is extremely unusual. Not only in, say, a infantry regiment, you don't see that, right? Maybe you do a little bit at the beginning of the war if there's like a freak accident or something, that does get recorded. Once combat starts, nothing. But also to be a HQ section or the headquarters of a whole division and have this recorded in a war diary, when these war diaries are so minimal, in my own experience, going through pretty much all the Canadian divisions that were involved in Europe, this is extraordinary. So those two must have made an impact. It's either the personal impact or because it was so close to the end. But then again, they have a sense, but they wouldn't necessarily know that this is towards the end, right? There's always uncertainty in war.
It was quite clear that 16 April was quite close to the end. I mean, by that time, the Russians were in the outskirts of Berlin, and almost all of the Netherlands was free. And Canadian sections were moving into Bremen and Hamburg. So yeah,
right, but
it was
it's
fine
true.
in the end.
Well, it's true, but you gotta, and then that is true in some senses. But to the private soldier or even people involved in maybe at a divisional headquarters, it's clearer, but they don't know, because I only know this because I know they were still planning operations into that part of Germany. Like Wilshaven was going to be attacked. So, I mean, yes, you can get this sense, and then people did in April have this sense, especially when Berlin's about to fall. But you just never know, right? So I think it does speak to those two. It has to, because there's so much uncertainty in war, and all of a sudden these two are killed, seemingly, my best word is randomly, right? Because I was hoping you could again talk about what's going on where they are killed, just give a bit more in-depth explanation of the situation that they were in.
Yeah, well, from what I know from my research, they were killed in or just outside the village where I live, Ilde, which is 10 kilometers to the south of Groningen. Ilde, by that time, had already been freed for 3 days.
Mm.
But still, somehow, they ended up dead. So the assumption has always been that they've been killed by a sniper.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't find anything to confirm that.
Right.
But I also couldn't find anything which denies it. It's quite possible that to conceive other scenarios. I mean, it could also have been an accident, or it could have been a Dutch Quizling, a traitor, someone with a gun. The thing is, I really don't know. The other thing is, am I interested to know? And that's a bit of a difficult question, because yes, of course I want to know what happened to them and why it happened. But I am really more interested in their lives. Harold and his mate John Tucky. I've tried to write about their lives, their story, their war stories, their war experience, and also how two normal people ended up in this war.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've tried to write the whole story up until they stood in the forest near Groningen and carved their initials in the tree. And what happened afterwards, how they were killed.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see my dilemma here?
Mm-hmm. No, I completely understand. I do. I mean, it's part of all of this story. I mean, I've had that struggle myself. I mean, I had a relative killed at Juno Beach, and maybe it's the historian part of me, but I did want to know. I wanted to find. I mean, the detail. I'm still doing work on this, but I did want to know, because that's just maybe me. But I just really wanted to understand what had happened. But I can completely understand. Yeah, you wanting to get these men's story first. Especially, to me, it's so interesting. I don't know, maybe it's just because the work they worked in. I mean, working in a divisional headquarters, it's something that doesn't get talked about ever. I mean, it's a story that is missed, that is not is not communicated, because it doesn't. I don't know. People like to use the word, the sexy history. That's the combat stuff, the tanks and the guns and the soldiers. I mean, the guys back in an HQ of a whole division are not going to get attention, and I think that is great that you did, because of how you've come across all of this and all the this discovering that you've done. I think is great, because it goes about the story in a very different way. And again, yeah, I completely understand the dilemma about not wanting to understand, but I just it's a question that inevitably gets asked, and people do want to know, because they just want to understand fully, but they do want to understand these people as people, right? And that's a big part of this.
I think it boils down to one thing. They were unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
They were really, really, really unfortunate. Harold's mate, John Tucky, he had 8 children. He was 37 when he was killed. He's one of the oldest Canadian soldiers buried in the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm.
And from what his family told me, the Canadian Army had decided to put him in the divisional headquarters to keep him
Safe.
Well, safe is not the word, because he was
Safe.
not safe. He ended up
Yep.
being killed. But to keep him out of harm's way as much as they could. But theoretical, on paper, they should have survived. I mean, it was 3 weeks, literally 3 weeks before VE Day. They were miles behind the front line.
So, yeah, it's the randomness of war, I think, is one way to think about it. This happens. Things go wrong, mistakes happen, people get, they let these mistakes, sometimes they make a mistake and it gets them killed. That happens a lot. Again, we don't know here. And again, we know, a lot of people know the story of how difficult it was to take that city. And the rear guards, the Germans, left up. There's the Dutch SS angle, part of this that is commonly discussed in Canada. Again, if you don't want to talk about that, that's fine. But it's just,
I have no problem talking about that. I've recently done a few guest lessons on a secondary school, and what I always say is when we say the Canadian Army, it's actually not as Canadian as we think, because there was a Polish division involved, and at certain moments during the war in Northwest Europe, there were also British divisions involved, and then there was of course Canadian divisions involved in the British Army. And I also always say it's not only the Canadian Army that was, well, mostly Canadian, but not entirely. When we say German Army, it wasn't quite that German. There were of course Germans and Austrians, but also, well, people from Eastern European countries who joined up for several reasons, but quite a few Dutchmen. And it's quite easy to ignore, or to just turn a blind eye and thought, oh, it's the Germans. But Germans and Austrians and Poles and Russians and Dutchmen.
Yeah, it's again, it's a bit of an aside, but when you mentioned the idea of a Quizling, which I'm not sure everyone knows. So what that is it's named after basically a collaborator in Norway who sided with the Germans and made things easier for them. So it became kind of a catch-all for traitor, collaborator, that kind of thing, especially armed in a sense. So I hadn't thought about that, but it's possible. I mean, it's unfortunate, but again, it's I think it's part of this story, because that does get mentioned, is how difficult those Dutch SS units fought and how long they held on.
They had nothing to lose. They had absolutely nothing to lose. In fact, the Germans, the Germans, actually hated them. They called them, with a German word, Kriegsverlängerer, which means people who prolong the war, because they just didn't surrender because they had nothing to lose. Whereas
it wasn't going to end either way.
There's actually an airfield just south of Eelde, just south of this village. It was there during the war. It was manned by around 800 German Luftwaffe units. They surrendered because one of the men from the village turned up at the airport in the morning of the liberation, and he explained the situation to a handful of drunk officers. He said, well, basically there's 800 people here. What you could do is you could fight, and then probably you'll be killed, or you could just surrender and be back with your families as soon as possible. So the whole Luftwaffe contingent on the airfield surrendered that way. The German SS, they didn't.
No, they never did.
And they, in the end, the Dutch SS, they didn't surrender, and in the end, Dutch SS, they fled to one of the Frisian Islands, and they surrendered, I believe, in June or July 1945. So that's good 2 or 3 months after VE Day.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that comes to mind to me, and I know other people as well when they hear about this part of the war. Because again, I mean, we're getting a bit off topic, but it's part of this because I think why it's important to know is to understand Harold's story. You can't separate that. Again, it's not necessarily about how he's killed, but I mean, just the ferocity of the fighting that's still happening in mid-April cannot be ignored. And this does happen in pockets, right? Like you said in one of the article you sent me that was translated into English. Some cities fall with nothing. Others, they fight to the death. And I think that is something, sorry, when I say they, I mean German and their forces that they have with them, like Germans and all depends again on who it is. But anyway, I just think that's important to remember, so that this death, the 2 deaths of these 2 men, is it's random. It is random. There's always going to be random death in war. That happens. It happens after war as well. I mean, there's numerous stories of Canadians dying accidentally. War doesn't stop death, but these things, it's something to keep in mind of what's going on at this point. So some random straggler or rear guard killing them is not out of the norm for what this type of fighting is like. So we don't understand fully, and we're never going to know how he's killed.
No, but the tragic thing is, he was from about the time that he arrived in the United Kingdom from Canada. He'd been trying to join his brother's unit,
right?
When his brother was in the 1st Division and was a dispatch rider in the 1st Division. And when that didn't work, he tried getting leave to at least be able to visit his brother, because at some time in the war, and we don't really know why, his brother moved from Italy to the United Kingdom, and Harold tried to get leave to be able to visit his brother in the United Kingdom, and every time this didn't work. And he started to get a bit frustrated about that. So I've read letters which he assigned as "your soon to have leave brother," or and then his during my time in Canada, I visited Lynn, the niece who I'd also met in Amsterdam, and she gave me a big plastic box with letters that Harold had sent to his brother, her father.
Right.
I found one letter, and it immediately cleared that it was Harold's, because I recognized the handwriting, and it was dated April 10, 1945, and that was the last letter I had read up until then was March 25. So he
right,
so to speak, he moved forward in time 2 weeks, 6 days before his death. And then in this letter, he wrote, "I have finally got leave.
Yeah.
I will be traveling on April 20, and I will be in the United Kingdom April 21, and then we'll drink beer."
Yeah, it's a common sentiment. I mean, yeah, it's such a tragic part of this. He was going to be gone. He probably would have ended the war in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, probably. Yeah,
probably would have. I mean, it's and there's another part. Sorry, I want to go back a bit here because I do want to keep talking about Harold, and then we'll talk about some of the stuff you found after. But the thing that stuck out to me, and again, covering these personal details that you don't know until you really get into this stuff, like you have done, is you mentioned, like before, he's a really good soldier. People don't get chosen as batmen, which are basically, the best word in English is servant, helper, basically with an officer, help them with their daily tasks and things like that. You don't pick somebody that's not trustworthy, but he does have one issue with discipline. And I think, I wonder if you could just tell everybody about that real quick as well.
Yeah, well, one issue with discipline, he ended up in a fight. He was in a training camp in Nanaimo, Is that how you pronounce it? Nanaimo?
That's perfect pronunciation. Yep.
Oh, thank you.
That's great.
Working. I suffer from the worst of afflictions, which is a Dutch accent. But
It's all good.
well, he was in a training camp in Nanaimo and in 1942, and around that time, his father's health deteriorated. His father, who had been a soldier in the First World War, suffered from lung disease. He had been hit by a gas attack around Ypres.
Yeah, he was at second. His father, and again, this is another big battle for Canadians. Second Ypres in April 1915. It's Canada's First World War, the first battle for Canada in the First World War. It's a big one.
Yeah, and also, if I'm not mistaken, the first time that the Germans used poison gas
on the Western Front. First
on the Western Front.
use of poisoned asphyxiating gas on the Western Front.
Yeah. And his father suffered from lung disease the rest of his life. And around 1942, his health deteriorated quickly. And he died. And then 3 weeks after Roszell Sr. had died, there was this mention in Harold's personal military files, that he ended up in a fight in a bar in Nanaimo. So, I mean, he was an exemplary soldier from all I can find. But, I mean, can you blame him? He must have felt terrible. And, well... And then you go into a bar and you drink a few, and someone says something wrong, and then things happen. So he was fined. I believe he was fined 2 or 3 weeks pay and then damages.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to talk about that, because I think because again, I am interested in these individual details, because it normally, how do I say this? The fighting of soldiers in bars is not uncommon. That happens the entire war, no matter where Canadian soldiers go. They have a reputation of being a rowdy bunch. They do all kinds of things they probably shouldn't do, but it's not uncommon. They brawl with each other. They'll fight the Brits, like they'll fight anybody. So, but when someone like him, who for all other reasons seems to be the perfect soldier and has no discipline, it sticks out. So I think why that's, and I'm glad that you included this in the articles, and it's in the book, I'm assuming, because I haven't read it. So anyway, sorry, I'll pause right there. There is a book. It's in Dutch, and there's a link to the publisher. If you can read Dutch, check it out. But you are working on getting this published in English, so that is
I hope.
Looking forward to. So once that does happen, that's exciting, and hopefully it does happen, and we'll see if I can help you do that. But that's great. But anyway, so that just stands out to me, because I've looked through I don't even know how many personal files now at this point. So to have that one case of discipline I think that speaks to who he was, and it must have, like his father's death must have really hit him hard to have this happen.
Clearly.
It's
also,
just. Sorry, go ahead.
Also, his mate, John, who was, of course, a family father, you can go to the archives in Ottawa, and you can look up his file, and there is his pay books.
Yes.
And every dollar he ever got in the army, he sent home to his family, except for one time, Christmas 1943, when he visited his mother in South Wales in the United Kingdom. He was originally from Wales. He had emigrated to Canada shortly after the First World War, and then he visited his mother for the first time since he'd emigrated, and he bought her flowers. That is the only time he did not send his pay to his family in Canada. So they were both.
They both seem like, just as we say, good people. Like they just sound like good people, and like you said, they were unfortunate.
Yeah.
unfortunate circumstances. Now, there's one part of the story too that is, especially someone who has a relative who was killed in Northwest Europe during the war, and I'll show it here. And I wonder if you could just talk about, again, what we're seeing is this photograph here, and because there's a story behind this too, right?
Yeah. Well, this is just about one of the first things I found when I started looking for Canadians and the Battle of Groningen, is this picture. It's difficult to see now, but when you zoom in to the cross, it's actually Harold's grave. And this, from what I could find in my research, it's a photo that was made on April 17, 1945, so a day after the funeral.
Mm.
And it's actually on the just across the road from where I used to live when we first moved to the Groningen region. And it's a temporary Canadian cemetery. It was in use for about a year. 21 Canadian soldiers who'd been killed in Groningen were buried there. And well, yeah, that basically, I hadn't known that the field, it's still a field across the road, had been a Canadian cemetery. And then all of a sudden I found this photo with Harold's name on the cross, and then these two girls. So the next thing I had to do was try and see if I could find the girls. And would you know it, one of them is still alive. Unfortunately, she has some memory problems, so she did remember living in this hamlet, this little village where the cemetery was, but she didn't quite remember well, tending after the graves, because after the war, local girls formed a group, and they looked after the graves for a year until the men were reburied in Holton. But there was a little group of local girls, and these two girls, Tini and Ruli, were in it for as far as I know.
Yeah, and again, you write about this in the article about finding this photo, and like you mentioned, the dates, the immediacy of this photo, and seeing the grave. He's just been buried and just had the funeral, but there are already people there.
Yeah, it's mentioned in the condolence letter from the army chaplain. He writes about this scene. He says how the graves were covered in tulips when they left.
Like, that's, to me, that's simply amazing.
The silly thing is, as I said, it's still a field. I cycle past it every time I go to Groningen, which is about 3 or 4 times per week. So every time I look to the right and I think, well, this is where it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is both strange because it's changed completely, but it's still as it was, difficult to explain. But this story is there are strong. Well, first of all, by some amazing stroke of luck, Harold's story was already documented quite well. I mean, as you said, he was in the war diaries. There is this photograph. The family still has the letters that he sent to his mom and his sisters. So all it actually needed was someone to connect the dots, and that was me.
Yeah, and again, that's amazing that you A, did so, but also B, that, like you just said, that was possible. This was recorded. I mean, like I've said a bunch of times already, but I've done research on a lot of individuals, looked at a lot of individuals, and sometimes all that's left is a service file and maybe some modern photo of, the headstone.
I think one of the most important things to mention is that I've been incredibly lucky with the two families, both the Roszell family and the Tucky family. They are wonderful people, incredible. And they've also been very, very helpful. And most importantly, they've trusted me from the start. I mean, it's imagine that one day, out of the blue, a journalist from another continent contacts you and says, "Well, I have a few questions about your uncle or great uncle who died in our liberations." Or in the case of John Tucky's daughter, I did find her address, but not an email address or a telephone number, just an address. So I resorted to old-fashioned letter writing. I sent her a letter. Imagine opening the letterbox and finding a letter from the Netherlands from someone who basically says, "I found out stuff about your father, who was killed 75 years ago in our liberation."
Mm-hmm.
And basically, their answer was, "Ernst, this is magnificent. Please come and visit us when you come to Canada." Mm-hmm. So I can't stress enough how wonderful they've all been and how helpful and how incredible it was that they trusted me with this story, with their story, essentially, from the start. That was really great.
Yeah, it's great to hear that the families, were open and receptive, because sometimes they're not. That does happen. Sometimes it's too painful. It's too difficult. They don't want to talk about it ever again. Other times they just don't know. That happens as well, especially now, as you said, with the veterans themselves they dwindle every day. But that generation is also not just the soldiers, but that whole generation is dwindling away. And maybe this is, again, one of my observations, but because my grandparents are of the Second World War generation, and I think this is a common thread. Is yes, a lot of them, those who fought and served, don't want to talk about it for their own reasons, and that's perfectly acceptable. But a lot of them are passing on, and their children want to learn more, or are more perceptive to these stories and talking about them. And this is where we're learning a lot more. And I meet a lot of people like that, a lot of people whose parents served. And it's just always great that they want to know, or they want to talk about it and tell these stories. And I think it's amazing.
Brett, it started with Lynn and Gord when I met them in Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. I asked Lynn about her father, who was a dispatch rider in Italy. Mm-hmm. And she said, "Well, my father really never talked about the war. I know he was wounded somewhere. I don't know how, I don't know when, I don't know what happened. That's it. That's all I know about his war experience." And then when I traveled to Canada for additional research, almost all the people I ever met, except my father or my grandfather, never talked about what happened in the war. They're just too painful or too difficult, or as someone suggested, my father wanted us to have a happy childhood, and didn't want to bother us with stories about the horrors that he'd seen. I don't know, but there are, I think, 6 or 7 people in the book who say, "Well, my father really never talked about the war." There's one person, Norm Baker from Toronto, recently died a few years ago, 102 when he died, I believe. And he had never talked about the war up until 1995. And then he started doing talks for secondary schools, and I was fortunate enough to meet him in his home in Toronto and to be able to speak to him and his family. But most people, they just
No.
never talked about the war.
Yeah, that's the story I hear. And well, in mine, when I meet people or the children of the Hong Kong veterans, as we were discussing, you're asking about my own dissertation. But again, that's because again they had such a horrible experience.
Yeah, well, Hong Kong is even worse, of course. I mean, for the Canadian soldiers who ended the war in the Netherlands, there is at least the feeling that they did something great, they did something marvelous, and the Dutch people still remember. I mean, that was a high note to end the war on. Face it, Hong Kong, completely different story. There's
no high notes there, but I think
definitely not.
No, definitely not. But I think in this case, and this is something I might be a good kind of ending point because it connects to the photo that we've seen about literally taking care of the grave that day or the next day, but also, and this connects to what we're talking about now with veterans not talking about it, is I think the reception that the veterans who were part of the liberation of the Netherlands received for the 50th anniversary of these events was a huge boost to what people like me or in the military history in the country in Canada generally, the reception that they received in these villages changed a lot of people's perceptions. A lot of people didn't want to talk about it here in Canada. We had the whole anti-war thing with Vietnam and all that got lumped together with the Second World War. The reception that they received, that opened up a lot of people. And that helped us understand Canada's war. It took the veterans going back 50 years later to really open us up. And I think as the Dutch people were so welcoming and so understanding of these men and these people, people who served.
I think it was. I think it was Canadian historian Jack Granatstein. How do you pronounce his name? Granatstein, who actually said there are two countries in the world that remember that Canada was even in the Second World War. That's Canada and the Netherlands, and in fact, Canada has forgotten. So yeah, it was the 1995 parade in Apeldoorn, where the Canadians marched through the city.
It's
through extraordinary scenes. Elderly women screaming and crying like they were 17, 18 years old again, and people holding up babies for the veterans. I want you to kiss my baby. So in later life, he can say he was kissed by one of our liberators. I mean, unimaginable. But
it's amazing.
Yeah, well, we still remember. That's shall I read? There's one small part in the book which is actually in English, which is the letter that the army chaplain wrote to Harold's mother.
Yeah, please go ahead.
And it's really touching. And one of the reasons that it really touched me is probably because I've also been in Toronto on the doorstep of the house where they lived at the time and where she must have read the letter. So where it is. So going back to the photo you showed earlier of the two girls looking after Harold's grave in Elderwolde. The army chaplain wrote, well, the funeral took place this morning in a temporary Canadian cemetery on the outskirts of a little Dutch village named Elderwolde, near the city of Groningen. There is very, very little one can say under these circumstances, except that you should be very proud of your son. He has played his part through and has done his share in the liberation of Holland, and to show their appreciation of what your son and the other Canadians who lie with him have done, the Dutch people have covered the graves with flowers. Great tulips in a vase were left on his grave when I left this morning, and tulips had been laid on it. His sacrifice has not passed unnoticed by those whom he has helped to free.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a better way to end the presentation today. Connects to all we're talking about, and it's great that that's included. Yeah, unless there's anything else you want to talk about, but I think that's a pretty good note to end on those words.
Yeah.
I think it sums it up better than probably either of us could. So it's great. Again, thanks, Ernst, for being on the channel.
My
I
pleasure.
really appreciate it. I really hope that this can get picked up by a publisher and published in English, because I want to read this story even more now. Especially I want to get really into this one because this is a great story. And like we were talking before, I want to learn more about the into the details of the Netherlands better. So I think that's a good step. So I'm just going to do a wrap up, and then I'll come say goodbye to you. Okay. So thanks everyone for watching. This was a good story. Again, kind of a wrap up to this week where unintentionally the stories were down to the personal level, that one individual, two individuals, that kind of thing. I think it's great to still hear these stories. We're still uncovering details this far after the conflicts. It's amazing to be able to hear these things. I think we're lucky in a lot of senses, and should really understand how lucky we are. So thanks again for everyone for watching. If you do like what I'm doing here, a subscription to the channel is very, very, very much welcome. I need as many of those I can get. Like the video also helps me a lot, and commenting, not in the sidebar, but after. But I do love the sidebar chats, but also after. So also, if you want, you can, and you want to keep seeing this stuff, I need some help on Patreon, and buy me a coffee if you can do anything to help there. It just helps me continue doing what I'm doing. So this is great. I'll include some more links to those things I was talking about in the show down in the description for watching later or checking this out after, all the different stuff, especially some of the stuff Ernst is connected to. So this has been a great one. So thanks again, Ernst, for coming on the channel. It's really, really appreciated. Did you like coming on the channel? Good. Not too tough on you.
Yeah,
questions.
It was great. It's I always like talking about this story because it's such it has been such a rewarding thing to do, and well, I could have gone on for hours and hours and hours because there's so much. There are so many angles to it.
Yeah, there's just I don't want to go any. I too, I got to stop myself because I could just go on probably all day. But I mean, it's just great to hear the detail of this, and wish you luck in the future with getting this in English, because I want to make that happen as best I can. Yeah. So.
The Canadian Embassy in The Hague is actually really excited about the story, and they've offered to chip in for an English translation. So it's actually quite safe investment for any Canadian publisher.
Yeah, I think it is. And like I said, what we were talking before, but we'll be in touch about some stuff. But again, thanks everyone for watching. And so next week, I've got a really different one coming as well. We're going to do a different, understanding of the First World War story in Canada by looking at a dog who's fundraising. So don't miss that one. That one's coming on Monday. So there'll be more details coming. But again, thanks again, Ernst, and we'll see everyone again on Monday.